Before Wallis Simpson shattered a monarchy, there was another woman who held the heart of the Prince of Wales for 16 long years. Her name was Freda Dudley Ward, and though history has tried to forget her, Edward himself once admitted he could never breathe without her. What makes her story even more shocking is that she came before the abdication scandal, before the crown fell into chaos, and she might have been the woman who could have saved him, if only fate had played differently. If stories like this captivate you, don't forget to subscribe, because on this channel we bring you the untold lives of remarkable women. Now, let's begin the untold life of Freda Dudley Ward. She was born Winifred May Birkin on July 10, 1894, in Nottingham, into a family of privilege, money and strict expectations. Her father, Colonel Charles Birkin, carried himself like the empire he represented, cold, rigid and unbending. He ruled their household like a regiment. Meals were stiffly silent, every movement governed by rules, every word weighed. To him, appearances mattered more than warmth, and reputation more than laughter. But her mother, Claire Lloyd, a spirited New Yorker with a Parisian heart, was nothing like him. Known as Pearlie for her radiant smile, she filled the house with music and light, softening the walls of that iron world. She told her children stories of faraway places, encouraged their imaginations, and refused to let the silence of her husband define the home. Where Charles was iron, Claire was velvet, and Freda inherited both. As the eldest of four, Freda was expected to embody perfection, polite, graceful, obedient, flawless in her manners. Outwardly, she delivered exactly that. But beneath her polished exterior was a restlessness, a spark that longed to break free of the lace curtain her family had woven around her life. That yearning came alive during her years at Heathfield, a prestigious boarding school where young girls of England's wealthiest families were groomed into models of decorum. The rules were endless, the rituals suffocating, and one sweltering summer afternoon, Freda could no longer take it. Rallying her friends with an audacity that shocked them all, she led a daring escape. Skirts catching on ivy walls, laughter spilling into the open air, they ran toward freedom. Their destination was the Ascot races. Champagne, bright hats, the roar of horses, a world away from the polished monotony of the classroom. The fallout was swift. Word spread. Her scandalized teachers dismissed her from the school. To Freda, it was a small price for freedom. To her father, it was nothing short of disgrace. Desperate to contain the scandal, the Birkins decided to send her across the Atlantic to New York, into the protective circle of her mother's family. But exile became a gift. In New York, Freda flourished. At every gathering, she was magnetic, witty, sparkling, impossible to ignore. Admirers followed her laughter like moths to a flame. Yet even there, in glittering ballrooms and crowded dinners, she was restless. Charm alone wasn't enough. She wanted more than applause. She wanted a life. In 1912, fate intervened aboard the RMS Morania. On deck, the sea air wild around her. She was approached by three men, Tommy Edgar Robarts, F.E. Smith, and William Dudley Ward. One, with a mischievous grin, plucked the novel from her hands and tossed it into the waves, declaring it unworthy of her brilliance. Instead of outrage, Freda laughed, a laugh rich, bold, and utterly disarming. It was in that moment William Dudley Ward, 16 years her senior and already a rising star in Parliament, fell under her spell. For Freda, Dudley represented something more than a suitor. He was powerful, connected, and ambitious. Yet he was also captivated, not by her beauty alone, but by her fire, her defiance of expectation. A year later, just before her 19th birthday, she married him in one of London's grandest ceremonies. At St. Margaret's Sayers, Westminster, she walked the aisle draped in silver embroidery and a veil pinned with orange blossoms, dazzling London society with her youth and grace. The reception glittered with champagne and music. Freda had entered the heart of the British establishment, and she wore her new title, Mrs. William Dudley Ward, like a crown. The early years of their marriage were a whirl of politics and high society. Their home became a gathering place for London's elite. Politicians, aristocrats, actors, all drawn to Freda's vivacious energy. She wasn't just a politician's wife. She was the life of every room she entered. In 1914, she gave birth to her first daughter, Penelope, Pimmy, to those who loved her. 2 years later came Angela, called Angie. Freda, unlike many aristocratic mothers of her era who left child-rearing to nannies, kept her daughters close. They danced at fêtes, appeared in society magazines, and grew up in a home where their mother was both their anchor and their brightest star. During the war years, Dudley served in intelligence, consumed by duty. Freda threw herself into charitable causes, bazaars for churches, relief efforts for families of soldiers. Outwardly, she was the model wife and mother, tireless and graceful, even as air raid sirens screamed through London nights. But cracks had already begun to form. Dudley's political career demanded more of him than his marriage. He was often absent, his attention consumed by Parliament and court duties. Freda, meanwhile, thrived on life, on energy, on the intoxicating rhythm of attention. Their union, once glittering with promise, began to feel like a cage. And then came the night that changed everything. London was under attack. Air raid sirens wailed across the city, the deep hum of German Zeppelins echoing overhead, anti-aircraft fire rattling through the darkness. Freda and a friend ducked into the shadows of Belgrave Square, their breath curling in the icy March air. Then, a door opened. Laughter and light spilled into the street. A woman beckoned them inside. And there in the cellar, among the crowd of guests sheltering from the bombs, she met him, Edward, the Prince of Wales. He was elegant, restless, his eyes scanning the room until they found hers, petite dark curls framing a face alive with curiosity, blue eyes that sparkled even in the dim glow of candlelight. Her laughter rose above the tension in the air, and Edward was transfixed. That night would set in motion one of the most scandalous, intoxicating affairs of the 20th century, a love story that would shape the destiny of a prince and alter the monarchy forever. The moment their eyes locked in that dimly lit cellar, something shifted. Edward, heir to the British throne, accustomed to the stiff rituals of court and the cautious smiles of courtiers, felt an unfamiliar rush. Freda, with her laughter echoing against the stone walls, was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't intimidated by his title. She didn't flatter him, didn't bow to the weight of his future crown. She treated him as though he were simply another man in the room. And for Edward, that was intoxicating. When the all-clear sirens finally sounded, the party moved back upstairs. Music swelled, glasses clinked, and the city, though still shrouded in smoke, seemed to come alive again. Edward sought her out. On the dance floor, they moved as if they had been paired for years, their rhythm so natural that the world around them blurred. For a brief moment, the Prince of Wales forgot who he was, and Freda was the reason. By dawn, as the pale light crept across London, Edward insisted on escorting her home. They lingered beneath a street lamp, the air heavy with unspoken possibilities. When he asked if he could come inside, she smiled with a gentle refusal, confident, playful, and entirely in control. Edward was left standing in the cool air, her laughter still ringing in his ears. The very next day, he wrote to her. It was the beginning of a flood of letters that would last for years, each one more desperate, more raw than the last. Yet fate played its first mischievous trick. His first letter, intended for Freda, landed in the hands of her mother-in-law instead. Mistaking herself as the intended recipient, the elder Mrs. Dudley Ward invited the prince to tea. Edward, awkward but polite, found himself sipping tea with the wrong woman. He left embarrassed, but undeterred. Soon after, he met Freda again. This time, there were no mistakes. Edward pursued her relentlessly. He was not a man easily denied, yet around Freda he became almost boyish, nervous, eager, desperate for her approval. She, with her warmth and her wit, made him feel at ease. For Freda, the thrill of having the most eligible bachelor in the world chasing her was undeniable. But she was far from passive. She played her own part with confidence, offering just enough affection to keep him enchanted, while never surrendering all of herself. Their secret meetings soon became legend among a tight circle of confidants. They would escape to KB's farm, a secluded retreat owned by her sister-in-law near Windsor. There, hidden from prying eyes, they laughed, talked, and carved out stolen hours. Edward would later call those their best stunts, his letters filled with fond recollections of afternoons spent away from the suffocating rituals of the palace. But war had no patience for romance. In March 1918, as the German offensive pressed forward, Edward was recalled to duty. His leave cancelled, he was sent back to Italy at his father's command. For Edward, the separation was agony. Alone in foreign barracks, he poured his longing into letters scribbled in pencil, filled with spelling mistakes and clumsy phrasing, imperfections that only revealed how deeply he felt. In them, he confessed he could not sleep without her photograph by his side, how he dabbed his handkerchief with her perfume so he could breathe her presence even when thousands of miles away. He called her Mummy, signed himself, "Your little David," and confessed that without her, he felt like a child adrift in the dark. For Freda, the letters were both touching and overwhelming. She adored him, yes, but she also understood the imbalance. Edward's need was bottomless. She was his confidant, his anchor, the one person before whom he could be vulnerable. But Freda also valued her independence. She knew she could never be consumed entirely by a man, even a prince. While Edward longed for her in the trenches, Freda's life in London carried on. She worked with the Voluntary Aid Department, offering support to wounded soldiers, and threw herself into charity work. But she was not immune to temptation. During this time, she began a brief affair with Captain Reginald Seymour, an equerry to the king. In his letters to her, Seymour cheekily referred to Edward as "your young man," acknowledging the strange triangle they all occupied. Edward himself confessed to flirtations of his own, including a dangerous entanglement with a French courtesan named Maggie Miller, a woman who would later become infamous for shooting her husband dead in a London hotel. The scandal nearly destroyed him, and even though the incriminating letters were quietly destroyed by the Crown, the shadow of that affair lingered. Yet despite these betrayals, Edward always returned to Freda, groveling at her feet, begging forgiveness, and remarkably, Freda forgave. To her, these little amusements, as she called them, did not threaten what they shared. Her calm detachment only drew Edward deeper, binding him tighter to her. Theirs was not merely an affair of the flesh. In his letters, Edward poured out the burdens of his soul, his hatred for the suffocating rituals of Windsor Castle, his despair over the monarchy's traditions, his longing for a life that felt real. This prison, he called it, that court life, beloved, it's going to hasten the end. People won't stand it anymore. For Edward, Freda represented freedom. In her company, he was no longer the heir to the throne, but simply a man who could laugh, complain, and be loved without pretense. For Freda, he was both exhilarating and exhausting, a prince whose devotion gave her power, yet whose dependence sometimes felt like a weight she could never put down. In September 1918, the Dudley Wards received an invitation to Windsor Castle, an honor reserved for the most trusted members of society. Freda dined with the king and queen themselves, unaware that her clandestine romance was already raising whispers among the court. George Vive, stiff and formal, found her charming but dismissed her as the lace-maker's daughter, a thinly veiled jab at her family's industrial background. It was a reminder that no matter how beloved Freda became in society, she would never be considered suitable for a future king. But Edward didn't care. In fact, he only fell deeper. Soon Freda became a fixture in his private life. He slipped away from Windsor Castle at night, pedaling his bicycle through quiet country lanes just to see her. By daybreak, he would return, exhausted but blissfully alive. Their circle of friends grew to include Sheila Loughborough, unhappily married to Freda's cousin, and Edward's brother Bertie, the shy, reluctant royal who would one day become George VI. Together, they formed what Edward affectionately called the Bear Leaders, a private club where the prince could let down his guard. But the secrecy could not last forever. As London's nightlife roared back after the war, Freda and Edward became bolder. They danced the Charleston at smoky nightclubs, mingled with Winston Churchill and Tallulah Bankhead, and turned the Embassy Club into their stage. Whispers swirled. To many they seemed like husband and wife already. Yet beneath the glamour, cracks widened. Dudley Ward tolerated the affair in silence, but his political career suffered. Divorce was unthinkable. It would have destroyed him and ruined Freda. Instead, they lived in quiet separation, keeping up appearances while moving further apart. And then came the tour. To silence the rumors and keep Edward occupied, the king and queen sent him abroad. On the eve of his departure, he and Freda exchanged tokens, small spider charms that became their secret symbol. As the ship pulled away, Edward wrote to her, "Both I and my spider are crying." It was a farewell filled with longing, but also with foreboding. For no matter how tightly they clung to one another, the weight of the crown and the shadows of others waiting in the wings would not be kept at bay forever. The ocean could not quiet Edward's longing. From aboard HMS Renown, as he sailed away on the long royal tour meant to distract him, he filled page after page with desperate letters to Freda. The Prince of Wales, idolized across the empire, adored by crowds who hailed him as their golden hope, was in truth a lonely man with a pen trembling in his hands. His words, scribbled in haste, read not like the polished statements of a future king, but like the ramblings of a young boy terrified of losing the only person who understood him. He begged for reassurance, called himself her puppy, her little David, pleaded that she not forget him. He confessed his loathing for official ceremonies, for endless dinners where colonial governors and generals fawned over him. "I want to be an ordinary person," he wrote. "I want to be with you." Freda, back in London, read his letters with mixed emotions. She loved him, yes, but she also knew that Edward's world was not one she could ever fully belong to. She was married, a mother of 2 daughters, a woman who valued independence as much as passion. His obsession was thrilling, but it was also dangerous. Meanwhile, London society buzzed. Whispers about the prince's infatuation grew louder. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the corridors of Buckingham Palace, Freda's name was spoken in scandalous tones. King George V, who prided himself on upholding tradition, sneered at her as the lace-maker's daughter. To him, she was a threat not only to his son's reputation, but to the very image of the monarchy. Yet Edward refused to let go. On his travels, he carried her photograph in a worn leather frame, kept her perfume on his handkerchief, and confessed to his companions that he longed only for Freda. His courtiers worried. They saw in him not a strong heir to the throne, but a man weakened by dependence, incapable of making decisions without her voice in his ear. Back in England, Freda was carving her own place. While Dudley buried himself in politics, she became a hostess of rare magnetism. Her home on Cumberland Terrace was alive with music, conversation, and charm. Politicians, aristocrats, and artists gathered there, but no guest mattered more than Edward. He would slip away from York House, his official residence, and spend hours at Freda's side. "I only feel at home here," he confessed to her one night, words that revealed far more than he realized. For Freda, the affair was not just romance. It was influence. Edward listened to her as he listened to no one else. She spoke to him of the hardship she saw in Dudley's constituency, of the wounded soldiers and struggling families left behind after the war. Edward, moved by her compassion, began to take an interest in social reform, something the royal family had never encouraged. She was shaping him, guiding his vision, turning his gaze beyond the walls of Windsor. But passion rarely exists in a vacuum. Edward was not her only admirer. Among Freda's closest friends was Michael Herbert, a charming banker from an aristocratic family, whose sister had married into the Vanderbilt dynasty. Michael was witty, handsome and vulnerable, and he fell deeply, hopelessly in love with Freda. Their relationship, tender but intense, ran alongside her affair with Edward, complicating her already entangled life. Edward hated Michael with a fury he could hardly contain. "That man makes me angry, sweetheart," he wrote to Freda, his jealousy spilling onto the page. Michael, equally consumed, poured out his fears in his own letters, admitting he could not bear to lose her. To both men, Freda was the center of the universe. To Freda, they were pieces of a world she had built for herself, a world thrilling, intoxicating, and impossibly dangerous. The strain began to show. Edward's devotion bordered on obsession. He begged Freda to be cruel to him, confessed that without her discipline he grew spoiled and soft. His neediness frightened even his closest friends. Duff Cooper, a rising star in politics, remarked after tea with the pair that Freda had a gift. She made Edward shine, always putting him at ease, always revealing his best side. But privately, others worried that his dependence on her was unhealthy. In 1919 and 1920, the whispers turned to open gossip. The King and Queen grew alarmed. They could not allow the Prince of Wales to appear enslaved to a married woman of middle-class origin. Their solution was as ruthless as it was calculated. Edward would be sent abroad again on a series of exhausting royal tours, designed to separate him from Freda and remind him of his duty. Edward wept the night he left her. To a cousin, Lord Mountbatten, he confessed that leaving Freda was like tearing out his heart. On board the ship, he covered his cabin walls with her photographs, read and reread her letters, and declared to anyone who would listen that he was a married man in all but name. But time and distance are dangerous companions. In Canada, in Australia, in India, he found himself surrounded by admirers. Women threw themselves at him, desperate for a touch, a glance, a smile. He played the role expected of him, the charming bachelor prince. But in his letters to Freda, he railed against the emptiness. "All the cheers, the gifts, the adoration, they mean nothing," he wrote. "I only want you." Freda, ever practical, reminded him that he could never escape his destiny. He was born to be king, and no matter how fervently he longed to be ordinary, the crown was his burden. Yet even she could not fully believe her own words. For the longer the affair went on, the clearer it became Edward's devotion to Freda was not a passing passion. It was the defining relationship of his life. Still, she tried to maintain balance. She was devoted to her daughters, Pimmy and Angie, bringing them into her social world in a way few aristocratic mothers dared. Edward adored them too, playing the role of affectionate uncle. The girls called him Little Prince, and he never missed a birthday. For a man so often consumed by duty and despair, Freda's family offered him something he had never known, the warmth of a home. But the weight of scandal could not be ignored. The king's disapproval hardened, the queen's contempt deepened. Court gossip painted Freda as a manipulator, a distraction, a dangerous presence in the life of the future king. By 1920, the situation had become a crisis. The royal family demanded that Edward sever ties with her. Edward, of course, refused. "I will never marry another woman," he told her in one of his many letters. "You will always be mine." But promises, no matter how passionate, could not rewrite reality. The crown was immovable. The monarchy was unyielding. and Freda knew it. By the autumn of 1920, under immense pressure, she attempted to end it. For Edward, it was devastation. He bombarded her with letters, each one more desperate than the last. In one, he went so far as to write, "How marvelously divine if only we could die together. I'm just dippy to die with you, even if we can't live together." The words revealed the depth of his despair and the darkness that lay beneath his charm. For Freda, it was a warning. Loving Edward meant walking a line between passion and destruction. She was not just the mistress of a prince. She was the keeper of his sanity, the anchor that kept him from collapsing under the weight of a crown he never wanted. And yet, as much as she tried to resist, she could not let him go. By the end of that year, their affair resumed. The cycle of longing, separation, and reunion would continue, drawing them deeper into a web from which neither could escape. But history is unforgiving. The scandal was spreading, the royal family growing more desperate, and others, women with ambitions greater than Freda's, were waiting in the wings. By the early 1920s, the love affair between Freda Dudley Ward and the Prince of Wales had moved beyond whispers. It was no longer just a passing scandal whispered in Mayfair drawing rooms. It was the defining relationship of Edward's life. Every day he sent her letters, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Pages filled with childish endearments, desperate pleas, and a devotion that bordered on obsession. He called himself her little slave, her puppy. He begged her to scold him, to be cruel to him, to treat him not as a prince, but as a man who needed discipline. In his words, you could see a man unraveling under the weight of expectation, clinging to Freda as his lifeline. He hated the palace, hated the endless routine of duty, and told her so with startling honesty. This prison, he called Windsor. The monotony, the courtiers, the silly traditions, they will hasten the end of it all. For Freda, these letters were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they proved her extraordinary influence over the most important man in Britain. She was not just a mistress. She was his confidant, his advisor, the only person before whom he laid himself bare. On the other hand, his need for her was overwhelming, consuming, at times even suffocating. She was a married woman, a mother of 2 young daughters, and yet the Prince of Wales demanded every piece of her. Meanwhile, society was watching. To the King and Queen, Freda was intolerable. Her background, her marriage, her presence in Edward's life, everything about her was a threat. They pressured Edward's younger brother Bertie to end his own scandalous affair, and they looked for every opportunity to separate Edward from Freda. Royal tours were arranged with exhausting precision, designed not only to keep Edward visible, but to keep him away from her. But Edward carried her with him wherever he went. On his travels, he covered his cabins with her photographs. He wept at night when her letters were delayed. He wrote to her from Canada, from Australia, from India, confessing that he loathed the adoration of crowds, that every cheer felt hollow because she was not there. "I only want to be with you," he told her. "All the gifts, all the smiles, they mean nothing without you." Freda, practical and grounded, often reminded him that his destiny was inescapable. He was born to be king. He could not run away from the crown. Yet even she began to see that Edward did not want a throne. He wanted escape, and in his mind she was the only way out. But Freda's life was more complicated than Edward realized. While he clung to her as his salvation, she had other entanglements. Michael Herbert, a wealthy banker with aristocratic roots, had fallen deeply in love with her. To him, Freda was not just a lover, but his great chance at happiness. He wrote to her constantly, begging for reassurance, confessing his fear of losing her. Edward hated Michael with a passion. In his letters he railed against him, calling him an intruder, a rival, someone he longed to confront. Michael, for his part, simmered with jealousy, confessing to Freda that her time with Edward tormented him. The rivalry between the two men, one a prince and the other an aristocratic banker, left Freda at the center of a storm she could not fully control. Her husband, Dudley Ward, tolerated the situation in silence. Divorce would have destroyed his political career and scandalized their world, so instead the couple drifted into quiet separation. They appeared together at events when necessary, but in private their lives diverged. Freda's heart was elsewhere, divided between two men who each demanded more of her than she could give. By 1922, the pressure was mounting. Edward's devotion to Freda was so obvious that even Winston Churchill remarked on it. "It is quite pathetic," he told his wife, noting how the prince's love for her seemed to eclipse everything else in his life. Churchill, ever the sharp observer, also warned that society would grow tired of it, that the door to this affair would have to be either open or shut. Freda herself began to feel the toll. Edward's endless letters, his constant need for reassurance, his emotional swings from adoration to despair, it was exhausting. At times she tried to pull away, to remind him that their relationship could never become what he dreamed. But each time, Edward dragged her back with desperate pleas. In one particularly dark letter, he fantasized about them dying together, as though death were the only escape from their impossible situation. And yet, for all the turbulence, their bond endured. Edward slipped away from the palace at night to see her. He refused invitations to events where she was not welcome. He carried her tokens, a little spider charm, a cross, photographs of her and her daughters, as though they were relics. His love for Freda was not a passing passion. It was his anchor, his rebellion, his way of defying a life he loathed. But Freda knew the truth. She knew she could never be queen. She knew she would always be the shadow at the edge of history, the woman before Wallis. And still, she stayed, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of compassion, perhaps because she too was caught in the spell of a man who was never meant to be king, and who clung to her as though she were the only thing keeping him alive. By the mid-1920s, others began to drift into Edward's orbit, women whose ambitions stretched further than Freda's. One of them was Audrey Dudley Coates, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, whose irreverent charm drew Edward's attention at a time when Freda was turning hers elsewhere. Another was Lady Thelma Furness, who would later hand Edward into the waiting arms of Wallis Simpson. But for now, in the early 1920s, Freda still reigned in his heart. Theirs was a love both passionate and impossible, a bond forged in secrecy and threatened by the crown itself. And as Edward clung tighter, as society whispered louder, Freda Dudley Ward walked a line no woman could tread forever, a line between devotion and destruction, between love and scandal, between the quiet safety of her daughters and the dangerous passion of a prince who might one day rule the world. By the mid-1920s, the affair that had once been whispered about behind lace fans and closed doors had become almost impossible to ignore. Everyone in Edward's world knew about Freda Dudley Ward. The courtiers knew, the royal household knew, even his parents, King George V and Queen Mary, knew, and they hated it. To them, Freda was not just unsuitable, she was dangerous. A married woman, a commoner, a mother, she embodied everything the monarchy feared in a royal mistress. It wasn't simply that she threatened to taint the image of the crown. It was that Edward loved her so much that he seemed incapable of doing anything else. He refused matches with princesses. He avoided aristocratic débutantes. He brushed aside duty, all for Freda. The king, a stern man of iron discipline, despised Edward's behavior. To George V, being Prince of Wales was not about love, it was about sacrifice. The crown demanded everything, and in his son he saw none of that strength. Instead, he saw weakness, indulgence, rebellion. He told friends in private that Edward would never make a good king. He said Bertie, his quieter second son, was the one who had the stability to lead. But Edward did not care. He had no interest in the throne. He once confessed to Freda that he wished Bertie could have it instead. He wanted no part of the endless ceremonies, the empty speeches, the suffocating expectations. What he wanted was simple, to be with her. By now, Edward's letters to Freda had reached an almost feverish pitch. He called her, "My darling little angel, my only joy, my divine darling." He begged her never to leave him. He described himself as a child in her hands, helpless, dependent, and the tone of these letters grew darker. He fantasized about running away with her, about disappearing from Britain altogether, even about ending his life if she ever abandoned him. For Freda, the weight of his devotion was both intoxicating and suffocating. She adored him, there was no doubt of that. But she also had her own life, her own obligations. She was still married, still a mother, still navigating the complicated triangle of Edward and Michael Herbert. To the outside world, she carried herself with dignity, elegance, restraint. Inside, she was caught in a storm no woman could control. Edward, meanwhile, began to grow restless. His dependence on Freda was absolute, but his eyes were also wandering, not because he wanted to leave her, but because he craved distraction. Women like Audrey Coates and Thelma Furness began to move in and out of his orbit. He toyed with them, charmed them, but always came back to Freda, confessing to her that none of them mattered, none of them were her. And yet, cracks were forming. Freda had less time for him as her daughters grew older and her social obligations multiplied. She was weary of the endless drama, weary of the constant pressure. Sometimes she pulled away, only to be dragged back by his pleading. Other times she indulged his fantasy of running away, knowing full well that it would never happen. Behind the scenes, the establishment was tightening its grip. Palace officials tracked his movements, kept records of his liaisons, and quietly worked to distance him from Freda. They encouraged his flirtations with other women, hoping that one of them might replace her. They arranged tours, events, distractions, anything to keep him occupied. But none of it worked. He returned from every trip more desperate, more dependent, more in love. His friends began to worry. Winston Churchill, one of the few who had a soft spot for Edward, remarked that his obsession with Freda was a sadness. He saw in it the fragility of a man who was supposed to rule, but who was instead enslaved by his own heart. Freda herself felt the strain. Her letters to him were gentler, calmer, less fevered than his. She reminded him to rest, to eat, to think of his health. She offered him steadiness, while he offered her chaos. It was a balance that sustained them for years, until the balance began to tip. By the late 1920s, Edward's fascination with Freda began to compete with his growing taste for women, who challenged the establishment even more directly. Lady Thelma Furness, an American socialite with flair and confidence, entered the picture. Unlike Freda, who tempered his wildness with grounding, Thelma encouraged his rebellion. She was fun, daring, willing to step into the limelight in ways Freda never had. For Edward, this was thrilling. But even as he flirted with Thelma, he still clung to Freda in private. He still wrote to her, still called her his true love, still confessed that he could never survive without her. The tragedy was that Freda believed him, but she also knew better. She had seen the way he shifted, the way he craved attention, the way he leaned on women for support. She knew he was searching for something he might never find, and she feared that one day his search would take him away from her forever. The tension grew unbearable. Edward's letters became darker, his dependence heavier. Freda grew tired, and just as the 1930s began, a new woman stepped into his life, a woman whose name would eclipse Freda's forever, Wallis Simpson. But in this moment, as the 1920s closed, Freda Dudley Ward was still the center of Edward's universe. She was still the one he turned to in the middle of the night, still the one who steadied him when he threatened to collapse, still the one who held the heart of the man who would one day walk away from a crown. And though she could not know it then, Freda was living in the final years of her reign, the quiet, scandalous reign of a woman who was never meant to be queen, but who for a time ruled the Prince of Wales more completely than any monarch ever could. By the dawn of the 1930s, the atmosphere around Freda Dudley Ward had shifted. For over a decade she had been Edward's secret compass, the woman to whom he poured out his fears, his frustrations, and his love. But time has a way of bending even the strongest bonds, and theirs was beginning to fray. Edward's need for her had not lessened, but it had grown unstable. His letters, once adoring and childlike, now carried tones of anger, jealousy, and despair. He would accuse her of neglecting him, of caring more for her daughters or her husband's affairs than for his desperate heart. And then, moments later, he would beg her forgiveness, drowning her in words of love. It was not devotion anymore. It was dependency. Freda, ever the composed socialite, began to feel trapped. She had given him so much of herself, but she was still a wife and a mother, tethered to duties beyond his world. Edward's obsession had begun to seep into her daily life, making her feel as if she were living two realities, one as the steady English lady, admired in drawing rooms, and the other as the private savior of a prince who seemed incapable of saving himself. It was at this fragile moment that new women began to move closer to Edward. Lady Thelma Furness was the first serious rival, an American with charm and boldness, so different from Freda's restrained elegance. Unlike Freda, Thelma did not quiet Edward's storm, she encouraged it. Their affair was more public, more flamboyant, more reckless, and the palace officials, exhausted from years of trying to separate Edward from Freda, welcomed the distraction. For the first time, Freda felt herself slipping from the center of Edward's life. He still came back to her, still wrote to her, still told her she was the only woman he truly loved, but the edge was gone. She was no longer the thrill, no longer the rebellion. She had become the constant, and Edward was a man who could not live without disruption. It wounded her deeply, though she carried it with silence. Friends noticed that she no longer glowed as she once had. She attended fewer events. Her laugh seemed quieter. Even Michael Herbert, her husband, could see the shadow in her eyes. And though their marriage was long fractured, he must have understood the weight she carried, because he offered her a kind of distant respect. Then came the moment that would mark the beginning of the end. At a party in 1931, Edward was introduced to Thelma Furness's friend, another American, a woman from Baltimore named Wallis Simpson. It was an introduction Freda could not have known would change everything. At first, Wallis was nothing more than a curiosity. She was sharp-tongued, witty, unafraid to mock the prince. Where Freda soothed him, Wallis provoked him. Where Freda offered comfort, Wallis offered challenge. Edward, who had grown restless even with Thelma, was electrified by Wallis's defiance. She did not bend to him. She made him bend to her. Freda sensed the change before anyone spoke it aloud. His letters grew shorter, his visits less frequent. There was a new edge of secrecy in his words, a hesitation that had never been there before. For the first time in over a decade, she felt him pulling away, and the pain was sharper than she had ever imagined. She had given him her youth, her devotion, her loyalty, and now she felt herself becoming a chapter he was closing. To the world, she remained elegant, Freda Dudley Ward, admired and respected. But inside she was watching the unraveling of the love story that had defined her life. Edward, blinded by his hunger for something new, did not see the depth of her hurt. He only knew that Wallis made him feel alive in a way no one else had. And so, step by step, he drifted further, until Freda's place in his world was no longer assured. The woman who had once ruled the heart of the Prince of Wales was now facing the most terrifying reality of all, being forgotten. By the early 1930s, the tide had turned. Freda Dudley Ward, once the central figure in the emotional life of the Prince of Wales, found herself slowly fading into the background of a story she had once dominated. For more than 15 years, she had been his sanctuary, the woman who steadied him when his world seemed unbearable. But now her role was changing, slipping away almost imperceptibly, replaced by a woman who would come to alter the fate of the monarchy itself. Wallis Simpson was everything Freda was not. American, brash and outspoken, she walked into Edward's orbit not as a comfort, but as a force of disruption. Where Freda soothed and reassured, Wallis challenged and provoked. Edward, weary of stability, found in her a dangerous thrill. For a man addicted to escape, her sharpness became irresistible. Freda felt the shift immediately. She had always known how to read Edward's moods, and she sensed that something had unsettled his heart. His letters, once overflowing with tenderness, became scattered, sometimes delayed for weeks. When he did write, there was a detachment she had never felt before. He still declared his love, still told her she was his only salvation, but the urgency had dulled. It was as though his words were rehearsed, no longer alive with the desperation that once defined them. Society whispered too. London's elite had long known about Freda and Edward, though they pretended not to. Now, however, tongues wagged about the American woman who had caught his eye. Freda, who had mastered the art of discretion, found herself being compared to Wallis's audacity. She was the quiet English rose, Wallis was the wildfire, and Edward, for all his titles, craved the flame. What wounded Freda most was not merely the loss of his passion, but the loss of his dependence. For years he had leaned on her as though she were the only thing keeping him steady. He had called her his darling Freda, begged her never to abandon him, confessed that he could not endure life without her, and now he was giving that vulnerability to another. It was as if she had been replaced not only in his arms, but in his very soul. In private, Freda bore it with dignity. She did not lash out, nor did she seek revenge. Friends noticed her silences growing longer, her laughter fading into something polite rather than joyful. She continued to appear at social gatherings, beautifully dressed and composed, but the light that once followed her seemed to dim. She had built her identity around being Edward's secret world, and now that world was being dismantled piece by piece. Edward himself seemed blind to the depth of her pain. His obsession with Wallis grew quickly, consuming him in a way even Freda could not have predicted. He began spending more time at Wallis's side, more evenings in her company, more weekends away. The palace, long troubled by his relationship with Freda, now had a new scandal to manage. Wallis was not only married, but she was twice divorced, and American, the kind of woman the establishment would never accept as the companion of the future king. Yet Edward did not care. In fact, the very disapproval fueled his passion. Where Freda had been his escape from duty, Wallis became his weapon against it. She represented rebellion, a defiance of everything expected of him. And Edward, who had always resented the rigid structure of monarchy, found himself intoxicated by the idea of breaking it apart for her. For Freda, the realization was brutal. She had once imagined herself as Edward's anchor for life, the woman who would stand beside him in shadows even if never in public. But as his obsession with Wallis deepened, she saw the truth. She was no longer essential to him. She was history. The final blow came not in a single dramatic scene, but through countless small humiliations, cancelled visits, unanswered letters, excuses that felt like lies. The man who once wept for her absence now failed to notice her presence. She was watching, in real time, as her great love dissolved into memory. And yet, Freda did not unravel. She clung to her dignity, refusing to become a figure of scandal. She did not fight Wallis openly, nor did she plead with Edward to return to her. Instead, she retreated gracefully, letting silence speak where words would not. It was the only power she had left, the quiet strength of a woman who had given everything, and now chose to carry her heartbreak with composure. But inside, the wound was deep. She had not only lost the love of her life, she had lost the identity that came with it. For years she had been the secret queen of his heart. Now she was a forgotten chapter, erased by a woman who would soon shake the monarchy to its very core. The world was beginning to turn its gaze toward Wallis Simpson, the woman who dared to hold a king in her hands. And Freda Dudley Ward, who had once been the center of his universe, was left in the shadows, watching history move past her. By the mid-1930s, the transformation was complete. The Prince of Wales, once tethered to Freda Dudley Ward by bonds of desperate affection, had given his heart and his will to Wallis Simpson. What began as whispers in drawing rooms was now an open scandal, dominating both gossip columns and the worried conversations within Buckingham Palace. For Freda, the shift felt like watching a play in which she had once held the starring role, only to be replaced without applause, her part erased as though it had never mattered. But she had mattered, perhaps more than Edward ever understood. For 15 years, Freda had been his solace, the safe harbor where he confessed his fears and escaped the suffocating expectations of kingship. Now, as he drowned himself in Wallis's dangerous orbit, Freda remained in the background, a silent witness to the unraveling of the monarchy. She had lost her place at his side, but she had not lost her clarity. She saw where his obsession was leading, and though she said nothing publicly, she carried the heavy knowledge that the man she had once steadied was hurtling toward a collision with destiny. The differences between Freda and Wallis could not have been starker. Freda had been discreet, shielding Edward from scandal, even as she gave him her entire heart. Wallis, by contrast, thrived on provocation. She was sharp-tongued, unafraid to challenge him, and perfectly willing to take the spotlight. Where Freda had hidden in the shadows, Wallis walked boldly into the glare. Edward, always resentful of being managed by the establishment, seemed to delight in her defiance. He was no longer looking for refuge. He was looking for rebellion. Freda watched as invitations that once bore her name were redirected elsewhere. His letters stopped coming altogether. The man who had once poured his soul onto pages for her now belonged entirely to another. Even their final meetings were marked by distance. Edward seemed distracted, impatient, as though seeing Freda reminded him of a version of himself he was desperate to forget. She represented stability, a quiet intimacy, but Edward no longer wanted quiet. He wanted fire, no matter how destructive it might be. And so Freda chose silence. She did not fight for him. She did not claw her way back into his world. It was not her way. Instead, she faded with dignity, allowing Wallis to claim the place she had once held. Friends close to her noted the quiet heartbreak in her eyes, the way her laughter never quite reached the same warmth again. But she never spoke bitterly of Edward. She never betrayed the intimacy they had shared. Even in loss, she protected him. Meanwhile, Edward's entanglement with Wallis was escalating into something the monarchy could not contain. The government, the church, even his own family stood in opposition. A king could not marry a twice-divorced American. To do so would invite crisis. And yet Edward was immovable. He had once told Freda that he could not live without her, and for a time she had believed it. Now he repeated the same words about Wallis, but this time he meant them with a reckless finality. For Freda, the irony was crushing. She had given him years of devotion, shielding him from the world's judgment, offering her love quietly and without scandal. Yet she had never been offered marriage, never been considered for the throne. Wallis, brash and unapologetic, was willing to defy everything, and Edward was prepared to defy the world for her. As the abdication crisis loomed, Freda found herself watching from afar. She was no longer part of the story, yet she had been the rehearsal for it. Edward had learned with her how to love against the rules, how to hide his true heart from public view. But with Wallis, there was no hiding. His defiance was on full display, and it would cost him the crown. In those final months before Edward's fateful decision, Freda was rarely mentioned. The world had already forgotten her, consumed instead by the scandal of the king and the American divorcee. Yet behind that silence lay a truth history often overlooks before Wallis. There had been Freda. Before the crown was shaken, Freda had steadied it, and though she had been cast aside, her shadow lingered over Edward's story, a reminder of the love that might have saved him if only he had chosen stability over fire. December 1936. The British Empire held its breath as the world learned what Freda Dudley Ward had long feared. Edward, Prince of Wales, now King Edward VIII, was prepared to give up the throne for Wallis Simpson. The announcement stunned the public, rattled Parliament, and sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Yet for Freda, the crisis was not a revelation. She had seen it coming, each step leading to this precipice. She had watched the man she once steadied slip further into the storm, blinded by his obsession with a woman who thrived on disruption. For years, Freda had been Edward's sanctuary, the one who absorbed his insecurities and softened the crushing weight of expectation. But as she listened to the abdication speech on the wireless, her heart tightened. He spoke with passion about his love for Wallis, insisting he could not carry out his duties without the woman I love at his side. To the world it was a shocking declaration of romance. To Freda it was déjà vu. She remembered his words in the letters he once sent to her, almost identical in sentiment. Once it had been Freda he could not live without. Now her place in history had been overwritten. The streets buzzed with disbelief. Some saw Edward as a romantic hero, sacrificing crown for love. Others saw him as reckless, weak, unfit to bear the responsibilities of kingship. What few acknowledged was the quiet truth. Freda had given him the chance to be both king and lover, to balance duty and desire. With her he had never needed to choose. But Edward was not a man who wanted balance. He craved extremes. And in Wallis he found the chaos that mirrored his rebellion against the life he had been born into. Freda did not seek the spotlight during the crisis. She did not write memoirs or grant interviews. Instead, she watched history unfold from the shadows, carrying the weight of knowing she had once been the heart at the center of this story. Her friends whispered that she listened to the abdication broadcast alone, tears running down her face, though she never spoke of it publicly. For a woman who had been so deeply intertwined with the future king's soul, her silence was its own act of devotion. The irony was brutal. The monarchy had tolerated Freda for years, despite whispers and disapproval, precisely because she was discreet. She had understood the delicate line between private desire and public duty. Wallis did not. Where Freda had concealed, Wallis provoked. Where Freda had soothed, Wallis demanded. The establishment had looked the other way with Freda because she posed no threat to stability. But Wallis shattered the very structure of the crown, and Edward chose her anyway. The abdication left scars that would never heal. Edward, stripped of his throne, became the Duke of Windsor, exiled to a life of wandering and fading influence. Wallis became his wife, but never his queen. For the rest of their days, they lingered on the fringes of high society, symbols of scandal rather than sovereign authority. To the public, they were the couple who chose love over duty. To Freda, they were a reminder of everything lost, not only to her but to the monarchy itself. And yet, Freda did not collapse under the weight of heartbreak. Unlike Edward, she found resilience in moving forward. She remained within the aristocratic circles, her charm and warmth still admired by friends and acquaintances. She continued her own life, quietly but firmly, without bitterness. There was no public scandal tied to her name, no humiliating downfall. History may have overlooked her, but those who knew her understood. She had carried the future king through some of his most vulnerable years, and without her, he might have broken long before Wallis arrived. It was said that Edward never truly forgot Freda, even as he dedicated himself to Wallis. Letters discovered years later hinted at lingering memories, a wistfulness for the woman who had once been his shelter. But he had chosen fire over steadiness, chaos over calm. Freda had been the love that asked nothing of him, and perhaps that was why he let her slip away. He longed for the kind of rebellion Wallis embodied, even if it consumed him in the end. For Freda, the pain of being replaced was undeniable. Yet she carried herself with dignity, refusing to reduce her life to bitterness. She had been part of history, though the official story erased her. She had loved a man who would one day become king, and watched him abandon everything, not just her, but the crown itself. Few women could claim such an intimate place in history, and fewer still could carry it with such silence. As the Duke and Duchess of Windsor settled into their long exile, Freda remained in England, rooted in the society that had once whispered about her. She became almost ghost-like in the narrative of Edward's life, her role diminished to a footnote overshadowed by Wallis. But those who had seen the depth of their bond knew better. Freda had been more than a mistress. She had been his first great love, the one who taught him how to open his heart, even if he later used that lesson to destroy himself. By the end of the 1930s, the world had changed. War loomed. The monarchy had reshaped itself under George VI, and the scandal of the abdication gave way to new crises. Freda's name faded from public consciousness, but in private circles she remained admired, a woman who had touched a king yet lived without bitterness or spectacle. She carried on, a survivor in a story that had consumed others. For Edward, there would always be the shadow of what might have been. With Wallis, he gained infamy but lost a kingdom. With Freda, he might have kept both, love and duty, had he been strong enough to see it. History would never frame her as the woman who almost saved the monarchy, but in truth, she had been exactly that. History is often merciless, remembering those who shout the loudest while silencing the ones who bore their roles with quiet grace. For Freda Dudley Ward, that silence became both her shield and her erasure. While Wallis Simpson's name burned across newspapers and history books, Freda's story faded into whispered recollections, her significance hidden behind the glittering chaos of abdication. Yet without Freda there might never have been a Wallis. She was the first to capture Edward's heart, the one who steadied him when he wavered under the crushing expectations of a throne he would never truly embrace. Freda's later life was lived with dignity, far from the firestorm she once embodied. She never sought revenge, never capitalized on her history with Edward, never sold her letters or traded her past for notoriety. Others in her position might have written memoirs, cashed in on the gossip, or sought to remind the world of their importance. Freda chose differently. Her silence preserved her dignity, though it also ensured her erasure. She would never be the woman who ruined a king. She would be the woman who had loved him quietly and let him go. Her marriage to William Dudley Ward had long since unraveled, and in the years that followed, she found companionship elsewhere. Yet nothing ever rivaled the passion and intimacy she had shared with Edward. It had not been a scandalous obsession or a theatrical rebellion. It had been steady, real, rooted in genuine affection. Freda had offered him what no one else could, normalcy. And perhaps, in the strange way of history, that was why he let her slip away. Edward did not want normal. He wanted the fire that would eventually consume him. As the years passed, Freda's presence became ghost-like in the corridors of power. By the 1950s and 1960s, her name rarely appeared in society pages. She lived her life quietly, surrounded by family and friends, always elegant, always gracious. Those who remembered her spoke of her warmth, her laughter, the way she could light up a room without demanding it. She had been adored not only by Edward, but by the circle of friends who knew her as something more than a mistress. And yet, history had chosen its villain and its heroine. Wallis would forever be painted as the woman for whom a king gave up his crown. Freda would remain a footnote, unless you looked closer. If you did, you would see a woman who had been at the very heart of the story, the one who revealed Edward's true nature long before the world knew him as the king who couldn't bear his crown. She saw his weaknesses, soothed his restlessness, and loved him without destroying him. In that way, she was the opposite of Wallis, and perhaps the truest reflection of the life he might have led, had he chosen differently. The end of Freda's life came quietly. She passed away in 1983 at the age of 90, far removed from the palace whispers and royal scandals of her youth. She had lived long enough to see Edward and Wallis grow old in exile, their glamour dimmed, their legend tarnished by gossip and suspicion. She had outlived the fever of scandal and watched as history hardened into myth. And she left the world without bitterness, carrying her story silently to the grave. But silence is never the end. Today, as historians revisit the tangled web of Edward VIII's life, Freda's name resurfaces, not as a curiosity but as a revelation. She was the woman who shaped him before Wallis ever arrived, the one who gave the world a glimpse of the kind of king he might have been had he learned to balance love with duty. Her story is not one of scandal but of sacrifice. She loved deeply, lost quietly, and endured with grace. The lesson in Freda's life is one history often forgets. Sometimes it is not the woman who makes the loudest entrance that changes the course of destiny. Sometimes it is the one who quietly stood before her, shaping the man in ways the world never saw. Freda Dudley Ward may never be etched into the official record as more than a name, but for those who look beyond the headlines, she remains the true woman before Wallis. Her life reminds us that history is not only written by kings and queens, but also by the hearts they break along the way. And as the screen fades, consider this: behind every scandalous love story, there is another untold one, quieter but no less powerful. Freda Dudley Ward was that story, and now it is finally being told. So if you found yourself drawn into this hidden chapter of royal history, if you believe more people deserve to know about the woman before Wallis, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love uncovering the truths history tried to bury. Because here, we tell the stories the world forgot.